Hello, dear prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 from May the 27th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So our text for today, let's dive right into our text. We're going to finish up the book of Numbers. Numbers 36 is our first text, and we have Psalm 80. We're a little bit over halfway through the book of Psalms. Then we have Isaiah 28, an interesting text with some New Testament connections. And then finally, we have the book, very short book of Second John. So let's dive right in with the book of Numbers. So we're finishing up the book of Numbers, and it's finishing up in kind of an odd way, I guess you could say. We're getting some more legal type of material, although it's in the context of narrative. So the situation is that you have it kind of recalls what we had in the book of Numbers in chapter 27, where you have these daughters who were going to inherit some land of their father. And that raised the legal problem of can daughters inherit? And Moses determines that they can, but what happens if they go and marry somebody from a different tribe? That would then become the possession of the tribe and not the father's tribe, which kind of defeats the purpose in the first place. And so Moses declares that the daughters may inherit the land, but they need to marry someone within their tribe. And so they end up marrying their cousins, which is kind of strange for us, but it was a common practice in the ancient Near East, and that resolves that issue. But once again, it highlights the importance of land. That will become so significant when we get to the book of Joshua, to a certain extent in the book of Deuteronomy as well. And it's been, this land promise has kind of been at the heart of everything that's been going on really since God first promised it to Abraham back in the book of Genesis. The final verse here in the text is a little bit of a transition verse that was put in to transition into the book of Deuteronomy, talking about the commandments and ordinances which the Lord commanded Israel while they were on the plains of Moab. And of course, that's what's going to dominate the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, the rest of the Pentateuch. Are the words of Moses on the plains of Moab as he exhorts the people right before they go into the promised land. So that kind of prepares us for the book of Deuteronomy. So that's the book of Numbers. An interesting book, isn't it? And love the book of Numbers for a number of reasons. It shows a very accurate picture of human nature, even of God's people, as some of the struggles that we still have. It provides those warnings for us. We see this again in the book of Hebrews, and other books in the New Testament that capitalize on those warnings that were given to the Israelites, or capitalize on the character of the Israelites in the book of Numbers to give warnings to the present audience of people that they're writing to. Don't be like that generation. And of course, as we've mentioned several times, this is a book that speaks very clearly several times in prophetic ways to the Messiah, whether that's Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24, or the prophecy that we saw in Numbers 21, speaking of the bronze serpent, which of course Jesus himself refers to in John 3, and many other places as well. So Numbers is a neat book, and we're moving on tomorrow to the book of Deuteronomy. So looking forward to that. That brings us to Psalm 80. Psalm 80 is a corporate lament. And if you want to turn over there, as I am, a couple of things that I noticed about this psalm. One is as a refrain. A refrain is kind of like what we have in our hymns when we have these repeated choruses. Refrain is something that's repeated several times in the text, and it kind of frames the text. So this is a lament, and it's crying out to God for deliverance. And that cry of deliverance is stated three times in this text, in verse 3, verse 7, and then finally the last verse in verse 19. And it has a little bit of development in each time. So if you wanted to pause and just kind of look at those verses and see how they're developed and how they kind of, I think you could say crescendo, they kind of are building up. So pause it, and then you can start back up and see if you can see what that is. Well, let's read them. O God, restore us and cause your face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. Verse 7, O God of hosts, restore us, cause your face to shine us and shine on us and we'll be saved. And then finally, O Lord God of hosts, cause your face to shine upon us and we will be saved. So there's a little bit of a development specifically in the name that is given to God. So it starts out with God, this more generic title, then the God of hosts, the God of armies, and then finally, specifically, Yahweh, the covenant God being called upon in verse 19. So there's that development there. You also have this phrase, to cause your face to shine upon us. I actually talked about this in, I think, one of my Sunday night sessions a few weeks ago. Talking about the shining face of God and we see this in several texts in the Old Testament. Particularly, I think that night we were talking about Psalm 67 and the shining face of God. But of course, we see this all the way back in the blessing of Aaron in Numbers chapter 6, the shining face of God, which is the lifting up of God's favorable disposition on his people. And what does that ultimately mean when God does that? Well, it results in salvation. And so this is, and that's reiterated the 3 times here in this text. And so the plea here is that God would come to the rescue of his people by shining his face upon them. I love too the reference to God as the shepherd of Israel in verse 1. I think that's a beautiful picture. Of course, we see this several times, and this is a kingly image, the shepherd imagery in the ancient Near East. And so this shepherding is that this king is a king who would provide for his people, watch over his people, guide his people, even as a shepherd would his sheep. Of course, we see that most famously in Psalm 23, but I think we oftentimes just see it in that pastoral role of the shepherd, but really it's a kingly role that we see in the ancient Near Eastern context, at least. And then finally, verse 8, we see that Israel is once again compared to a vine, and we've talked about that before, but I'm going to move on from there. But I think what really draws me to this text is the refrain, the crying out to God for restoration and deliverance. Now, we have 2 texts here that, the text that we're going to move to now in Isaiah 28, that has a lot of connections with the New Testament. Now, Isaiah 28 is moving to a different section in the book of Isaiah. So in Isaiah 28 through 35, we're going to have a section where we have 6 different what they call woe oracles. And you can tell why they call it a woe oracle, because an oracle is just a message, right? Given from God. And it's called a woe oracle because it begins with woe. As in verse 1 of chapter 28. You'll also see this in, let's see what the other verses are, chapter 29, verse 1, verse 15, chapter 30, verse 1, chapter 31, verse 1, and chapter 33, verse 1. And so it's proclaiming woe or warning or imminent destruction, specifically because of the arrogance of Israel and of Judah, and they're about to experience some extreme judgment. So this is getting back to some of the political situations of the day that we read about all the way back in specifically in chapters 6 through 12, where Israel is facing that imminent threat from the Assyrians, and they were in response to that threat, which Assyria was definitely a threat. They were marauding up and down the Levant, up and down this area of Syria, Palestine, spreading destruction the whole entire way. So if you were a people in that time period, what were you going to do? Well, some of them were kind of oblivious to this. So we read about the prophets here in chapter 28 and the priests who were just reeling with strong drink, and they're just kind of trying this escapism, right? And they're not listening to what Isaiah and the true prophets of God are saying. That all they hear is verse 10, order on order on order on order, line on line on line, a little here, a little there. Just kind of this mumbo jumbo is all they're hearing. But really, Isaiah is crying out to them to listen and The other thing that they're doing, though, is that they are trusting in anything other than God Himself. So they're trusting, for instance, in treaties with foreign powers, like, for instance, Egypt. And this is something that is called ultimately a covenant of death in verse 15. So you make these agreements and treaties with these foreign powers and trust in them rather than God. That's only going to lead to death. This is getting to the very real political situations of the day of Israel facing that imminent threat of the Assyrians. Well, what should they do? Well, they should trust in the fact that God has given them promises, focused in on a messianic king, but also focused in on His presence among His people in Zion, in Jerusalem, where He would place His name. His promises to preserve a remnant. All these things that were themes, by the way, when we go back to Isaiah 6 and His call narrative. God amidst among His people, displaying His holiness, God preserving a remnant, God giving a Messiah. All these things that were evident from the very beginning of Isaiah's call, that's what they should place their trust in. And that's where we get to verse 16, which is a significant verse when it comes to the New Testament. So if you have a reference Bible, you'll see this is quoted many times over in the New Testament. But probably most significantly in Romans 9 and 10, 9:33 and 10:11, and then 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6 is perhaps the clearest one. And in those cases, referring to, of course, in a messianic direction. And it says, "Behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly stone for the foundation." Idea of building up, God building up something. And there is a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion among scholars on what this is referring to. But ultimately, I think it refers to God, those things that we just talked about, that God is building His people. It's going to be centered around His presence among His people, and it's going to be centered around His messianic king. And where do we see that displayed? Where do we see that most evident? Well, it's in the person of Jesus Christ. And so significant text here, and one that we could probably spend another hour or two talking about, because there is a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion on it, but we don't have that time. So if you have further questions on it, just let me know. And that brings us finally to the book of 2 John, also written by John the Apostle, as we've talked about before. And he's writing this to a chosen lady. Now, by the way, if you want more details on 2 John, if you go back, I think, to the beginning of the year, I did a Bible 101 on this, and then you can probably still find that recorded on YouTube. I think we have all those Bible 101s, at least since the pandemic hit. We have all those Bible 101s on YouTube. But we have one on 2 John and on 3 John, on 1 John as well. So if you wanted to check that out, you can. And he's writing this, but I'll just give you a few details on it right now. He's writing this to what he calls the chosen lady. Now, is this a specific woman that he's writing to? I don't think so. I think this is figurative in reference to the church. Refers to the chosen lady and her children, probably the church and the individual members of the church. Obviously, one of the things you see in this text is, or in the New Testament as a whole, is the church being referred to as the bride. And so you can see why it'd be this church would be referred to as the chosen lady. And you also see here the use of second person plural, so you plural rather than you singular. So if he was writing to a specific woman, you might expect it to be, just to you, a singular woman. But no, he's writing to a group of people, the church. And he's writing them as kind of similar situation to the church, to resist false teachers, even to the point that they are not even to welcome them into their house. Look at verse Verse 10, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him even into your house. Do not give him a greeting, for the one who gives a greeting participates in those evil deeds. So don't extend hospitality to these traveling preachers who are teaching false doctrine. It's probably the situation here, particularly the doctrine of Docetism that we've talked about before, as this doctrine that Jesus only seemed to be in the flesh, only seemed to be human, but really wasn't. And of course, Jesus is 100% God, but also 100% man. That's the traditional and the right biblical position on who Jesus was in his person. So we need to affirm that, and that's a heresy if you deny that. And so John shows us how we are to take those types of things very seriously. Now, does that mean that, you know, we don't agree with somebody, we don't welcome them into our house? I don't think that's what John is saying here, but he's saying, I think, especially in that first century context, we need to take false heretical teaching seriously. Don't give any kind of don't do anything that would show an endorsement of such teaching, I think, is how we can apply that specifically. So, and of course, we have some other things that we have in here that we also saw in First John, talking about walking in according to the commandments. One of the commandments that he gives his people, which is a commandment we need to take seriously, is to watch ourselves that we do not lose what we have accomplished, that you may receive a full reward. So, you know, maintaining that posture of watchfulness in our Christian life is a strong admonition here. And then he has the interesting phrase in verse 9 of abiding and teaching. Oftentimes of course, Jesus talks about abiding in him in John 15, but there's also a sense of abiding or living in and a close relationship with teaching as well, and with the strong teaching that we find in the scriptures. So some good admonitions here in the book of 2nd John. I know we've gone a little bit longer than probably we should, but hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, May 27th, 2027.